I've been lucky to jump around to so many different disciplines and tools. So my art plays a big role in the story development, but it all comes down to what is character and why do we care so much about this transformation?
How do you like to define story? What is story?
That's a great question. Okay, so story ultimately is the presentation of an event or a series of events. Like if you want to boil this down to the simplicity, like in a way looking at story as it relates to narrative. You know, a lot of people kind of conflate the two, like story and narrative are the same thing in a way. But I think they function very specifically, very distinctly. Like in my book, The Story Ritual.
Oh, it's beautiful.
Thank you. I take a step aside and say, let's talk a little bit about the difference between story and narrative, because I think the distinction's important. And the story is ultimately the presentation of a specific experience or a series of events. And then narrative is the way we internalize that story and make it meaningful to us. Ultimately, the way we form beliefs. And this is what I think is the most important part of story, but I also think it's largely unexplored and it's not broadly discussed enough because of the way people are denigrating belief so much. But belief ultimately, is your belief, our beliefs, everyone's belief is a narrative. And that narrative is the story we live our lives by. It's the way we create, our mind is a predictive machine. So we are constantly trying to make sense of all the chaos around us. And we use narratives to identify, threats and opportunities and have some sort of relationship to get what we want out of it. So we use narratives to predict it. So story, so for example, the example I use in The Story Ritual is, we'll say a character, Amanda, takes her dog up to the canyons and goes hiking. And her dog is attacked by coyotes. And now she has to get a new dog. Okay, so that's a story. And the story is, she just lost her dog to coyotes because it's a smaller dog. So the story is a specific event. Because of that, I'm not going to go up to that same canyon and bring my little dog up there. That becomes the narrative. That's the belief. If I take my dog up to the canyon, coyotes will attack it. So the distinction between narrative and story plays a very, very important role. And the story becomes a kind of representation that fills all of our belief networks. That's why I think like story is, if you want to get into what makes us human, it is essentially the story animal. And we are animals of story. This layer of consciousness that sits on top of all of our subconsciousness, that sits on top of all of our like animal instincts, is what separates us from the rest of the other kind of creatures, the other animals in the world, because they're all operating off instincts. Whereas we are using stories to arbitrate our relationship with the world around us.
What story animal are you?
So what story? So technically Homo sapien, right? But ultimately that's what, sapien means wisdom or the knowing homo, human. So the knowing man or the knowing human. This is something that's been fascinating me recently, is just so much of what we're learning about kind of the parallel evolutions. We've got Homo sapien and then Homo Neanderthal. And then before that we had the Denisovans, I think, that evolved parallel to us and then died out. And then Neanderthal died out or was subsumed or consumed into sapien. But ultimately, that's what's so interesting, is the thing that separates Homo sapien, humans, from other Homo genus or hominid is that story element. It's that element that we have a kind of what we call reasoning or rationale as a kind of PR firm that we all carry around with us, negotiating like our relationship to everything around us. Are you familiar with Jonathan Haidt?
Oh, no, but you always bring up great examples.
Yeah.
Please tell.
So Jonathan Haidt is an American psychologist, and he has several brilliant books. I strongly recommend it. But in my book, I mentioned specifically his relationship that he came up with this great metaphor that illustrates the relationship between the conscious and the subconscious. And he calls it the elephant rider. That's the example of the elephant rider. Because basically the way the consciousness works is our subconscious, our actual values, the things we desire, the appetites and beliefs we have are largely, they're an elephant. And they're gonna go whatever direction the elephant wants to go. If it smells something in that direction, if this looks easy or comfortable, or if this trail looks interesting, it's gonna go in that direction. It's gonna explore its appetites based on what its drives are. And then our conscious decision-making process, the executive functions, is like the elephant rider. It's that little pilot sitting up on top that thinks they're pulling the reins. And so most of us think of like, well, I'm making this decision. I'm gonna drink this shake because I've decided that, sure, it's got a lot of sugar, but I've just decided that I've earned it, so I'm gonna drink it. And the truth of it is your unconscious has decided, your appetites have decided, I wanna drink this, and your elephant rider has said, let's come up with some good reasons. It's rationale. It's rationalizing the decisions that it wants to make. And that elephant rider that we all carry around with us is that storyteller. It's the story machine. It's tapping into the elephant. It's tapping into the unconscious and then saying, I know that I want this. Let's come up with some interesting metaphors or reasons to justify wanting that. And to me, that's Jonathan Haidt's metaphor, but I think it's so key in understanding the relationship between the unconscious and the conscious minds.
And so going back to story versus narrative, if we talked about the Minotaur, which we referenced in the first clip, then if both you and I heard that story, that's the story, but then we're each going to ascribe different meanings to it.
Absolutely.
So one might say this is a story of shame, one might say this is a story of redemption, different things, but that's our narrative at work, defining it. Okay.
Exactly.
Okay.
So there's this thing I talk about in the story ritual where, okay, in essence, every story is about belief. And the idea of the story ritual, the whole thesis of the story ritual is that my theory that I'm posing, or the premise that I'm posing, is that what people are describing as the character arc. Everybody talks about your character has to arc. A lot of screenwriting gurus or novelists as well as talking about arcs. And so I kind of drilled into this question exactly, what do they mean specifically by arc? And what do I use? I've got over 20 years working in the industry, mostly working as, in consultation and production, storyboard artist, concept design, character designer, all of these different, I've been lucky to jump around to so many different disciplines and tools. So my art plays a big role in the story development. But it all comes down to what is character and why do we care so much about this transformation? And, does it even play a role? And you look at someone like John Milius, the writer of Apocalypse Now, original writer, and he says, I've never heard of character arcs. I don't care about character arcs. It doesn't even occur to me. And yet, when you look at his stories, you see the transformation of these characters. So I became very interested in this idea of what is it exactly that transforms. And once we drill into this, I feel like in the story ritual, what I've taken the time to really drill into is this idea of it's belief. And a belief is ultimately the product of our unconscious drives meeting story. And it's the narratives that the characters live by. And through opposition or conflict, they actually start to have to renegotiate those stories. They have to change the stories they're living by. And to me, that's what becomes so interesting and important in story, is that when we engage with the character's beliefs, all of a sudden we're delving into much more meaningful stories that are not just surface level kind of problem solving stories, but stories about what it means to be human.
Thank you for watching the video all the way to the end. Here is a complimentary question from our book Story Questions.